Welcome everyone, thanks for coming along and to Politics in the Pub. I was here a few years ago and the place hasn't changed a great deal, but it is certainly a homely and cosy little spot. Sustainable Australia is a political party, as Joe mentioned. We've been federally registered for best part of a decade, but we recently also succeeded in getting state registration in both New South Wales and Victoria. So we've got the Victorian election coming up in November and New South Wales in March, and we've got a federal election in May. I think everyone's going to agree that Malcolm's going to wait as long as possible now to go to the polls, so I think he'll just try and hang on to the Prime Ministership for as long as possible. So 3 elections coming up in 9 months, so we'll probably get a good chance to put our brand out there, and rather than just turning up every few years and being one of 40 parties on the Senate ballot paper, we'll get a chance to run through a few elections in a short space of time, and hopefully you'll hear a bit more about us. I guess we are looking at 4 key issues that we're trying to achieve. They are around jobs, housing, planning and environment. In particular, we're looking at trying to have more secure jobs via a more diverse economy. We're trying to achieve affordable housing for first home buyers and renters, better planning to stop overdevelopment, and a sustainable environment. There's no silver bullets to achieving those grand aims, and probably a lot of political parties would say they've got similar aims, and I think in the end you have to differentiate via policy. So affordable housing, how do you achieve that? Well, again, there's no silver bullet. There's no single issue that's going to achieve affordable housing, but we're saying that there should be major tax reform. We'd like to see the end to speculation or speculative tax breaks such as negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions. We'd like to see Australian homes limited to citizens and long-term permanent residents. And we'd like to see slower population growth. So we think that population is an important issue. It's not a false choice between it's population or it's something else. We think it just has to be in the mix in terms of achieving secure jobs and decent wage rises, or achieving affordable housing, or achieving a sustainable environment. And that's why we call population the everything issue, not because it is everything, but because it affects everything. I do want to focus on the environment tonight personally. We know that population is a global and a local issue. World Population Day is an annual UN event that happened on July 11. Probably no one heard of it, but it seeks to raise awareness of global population issues, and there is an opportunity to reflect on July 11 on population and how it impacts on quality of life and the environment. In 2018, the world is around 7 billion people. It's up from around 2 billion when Sir David Attenborough was born. So an enormous growth, and we're looking at heading to around 10 to 12 billion this century. And that is just incredible. Break it down into nations or regions. You've got a place like India that's growing by the population size of Australia every year. And then another example is Japan, which after a century of hyper growth, in World War II they were about 60 million, now they're double that, over 120 million, but finally they're turning around and they're starting to reduce their population. They need to import 80–90% of their energy and food, so they're way over a sustainable population. So it's good to see Japan turning around, from my point of view anyway. They've still got economic growth, by the way, so even with negative population growth they're able to get per capita growth. Their per capita GDP has grown more than places like Europe and Australia over the last decade. So it's a bit of a myth buster around economic growth. The global picture is challenging. If you look at the WWF They've been warning us for many years in their Living Planet reports that human demand for environmental resources is increasingly outstripping nature's supply. Our ecological footprint basically tracks humanity's demands on the biosphere by comparing humanity's consumption against Earth's regenerative capacity, or biocapacity. So during the 70s, humanity passed the point within the calendar year where the annual footprint matched the Earth's annual biocapacity. What that meant is we went into ecological overshoot. It's a bit like a bank account. You know, you might have $100, earns 5% interest. You're spending more than $5 per year of the renewable or the sustainable amount of resources. So you're starting to go backwards in terms of your capital. What it's come to today is we're currently using about 1.7 times the Earth's renewable resources. It takes basically 1.7 Earths to regenerate the resources we need. It's a complex picture. That's a simple statistic, but it's a complex picture, and it differs by regions, and there's all sorts of reasons: types of consumption, number of people, and so forth. And again, I'll stress, it's not just one issue. It's not about population. It's not just about consumption or the way we use resources, or you know, blaming one country or one region. But it really is a more complex issue than that. But there's no doubt that population growth does impact on all environmental impacts, or does exacerbate all environmental impacts. If we are concerned about our increased greenhouse gas emissions, or our water shortages, or soil degradation, deforestation, species extinctions, invasive mining, then we do need to look at more than just one issue, and we do look at the amount of resources per capita or per nation, as well as the number of people. The founder of WWF, Sir Peter Scott, once said, and I quote, "You know, when we first set up WWF, our objective was to save endangered species from extinction, but we have failed. We haven't managed to save a single one. If only we had put all that money into condoms, we might have done some good." So let's have a bit of a closer look at Australia, because of course we are Australians, we're a sovereign nation, we're judged on our international outcomes on issues such as greenhouse gas emissions. Australia has, for more than a decade, led the world and is on track to nearly double the nation's population by mid-century to around 40 million people. And it doesn't stop there. We're on track to hit 80 million people this century in the lifetime of a child born today. That's driven by annual population growth that's roughly twice as high as the post-war average. And it is primarily due to migration. We think that rapid population growth is a negative thing, regardless of whether it comes from high native fertility as it does in some countries, or high migration as it does in others. So it's really important that the issue is population rather than immigration per se. But immigration, because our fertility rate is around 2 children per woman or just under, you know, it largely is migration that is feeding the growth in population in Australia. The latest federal government State of the Environment report, released last year, explicitly noted that Australia's natural environment is being placed under acute strain from rapid population growth and related economic development, and noted that these are the main drivers of environmental problems such as land use change, habitat destruction, invasive species and climate change. In March this year, a team of scientists published their recommendations for slowing current rates of biodiversity loss in a paper in Nature, Ecology and Evolution. And this was reported on the ABC earlier this year. And it said that although key threats to biodiversity include habitat clearing for cattle, mining and urban sprawl, these are all consequences of population pressure and high rates of resource consumption, according to Deakin University researcher Ewan Ritchie. And Ewan went on to say that it's often a taboo subject to talk about population, size and planning and family planning, as well as how much we consume as individuals. But they shouldn't be, of course. He said that if we don't address these issues in the context of biodiversity conservation and sustainability, then we're largely kidding ourselves, unquote. End quote. So Dr. Ritchie argues that Australia's poor record on species loss means we need to make changes to halt the loss of biodiversity here. We do have one of the world's worst biodiversity loss records in areas such as mammal conservation, and these issues do require action. They're not the first environmental studies to draw links between the environment and population growth. In 2010, Flinders University released a report to the Department of Immigration and Citizenship examining the long-term physical implications of net overseas migration, NOM. This report concluded that higher levels of NOM impose greater adverse impacts on the quality of our natural and built environments, and that the geographical concentration, particularly within places like Sydney and Melbourne, and at the time Perth, although not so much now after the boom, they substantially increased their environmental impact. The report also found that decreased urban water supply is a significant environmental constraint exacerbated by the higher levels of net overseas migration. In particular, modelling shows the vulnerability of Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth to deficits in water supply. Some of you may be aware of what's going on in the Blue Mountains at the moment, wanting to raise the dam walls. Really significant impacts on the ecology of the area and on the rivers in the area. So that is just another symptom of what they're talking about in our university scientific reports. The Flinders University report also noted that Australia's water resources could only cope with NOM of up to 50,000 people per year versus the 200,000 plus current. And it said, I quote, only NOM levels of 50,000 per annum or less result in Melbourne and Sydney maintaining a small surplus of net surface supply over demand on average out to 2050, assuming current climate conditions persist. Big question mark there. Potential options to alleviate water stress at high NOM levels over the longer term will be hard to find, end quote. Also, the Australian Conservation Foundation at times has spoken on the issue of population, and it did in 2010, probably the last time the ACF has talked about this issue in any real way, but it did nominate human population growth as a key threatening process to Australia's biodiversity. We know people like Tim Flannery have had a look at these issues, and he's actually said that the long-term sustainable level is probably half of what we have at the moment, but it's difficult to see how we would get down there, but perhaps we need a new report. In 1994, when we were about 17 million, the Australian Academy of Science convened a symposium on the future of population in Australia. Its analysis was extended to Australia's resources of water, minerals and arable land, and the interactions between present lifestyle and present environmental damage, and between future expectations and the cost of increasing population. The Academy of Science calculated that if our population reaches the high end of the feasible range, 37 million by mid-century, and remember this was back in '94, the quality of life of all Australians will be lowered by the degradation of water, soil, energy and biological resources. So they concluded back then that the quality of all aspects of our children's lives will be maximised if we keep Australia's population to the lowest achievable range of about 23 million to mid-century. Obviously, just 24 years later, we're at 25 million now, so they've exceeded their recommended maximum population in that regard. Of course, they have a couple of caveats there, to be fair, and it says the interactions between present lifestyle and present environmental damage. Of course, we need to change our lifestyle. We need to make big changes. So we would talk about all sorts of things of rail instead of roads, all those types of issues that we need to change in our cities and across our regions. But we're not really doing that at the moment. So I think the major parties are just putting in as many roads as they can, and so it's very difficult to get all of the best sustainability planning happening, and at the same time we've got this breakneck population growth at the same time. So an issue obviously being climate change is really key, I think, here as well. That probably wasn't envisaged as well back in '94 as it is now. And a recent University of Adelaide-led study did find that current population growth rates in Australia will make greenhouse gas emission targets even more difficult to achieve in the future. The researchers looked at the current national targets of around, it's about 25–30% reduction on 2005 to 2030. If we and they basically concluded that if we maintain constant proportional net migration of 1%, we would have roughly 10% more emissions by 2030 than if our population remains stable. So again, yet another environmental impact that is made, is increased and made more difficult to achieve. We are judged internationally by our national targets, and therefore the point is, it's made more difficult. Of course, we need to transfer to renewable energy as quickly as possible, but even if we get the heroic, halving of our per capita emissions by the middle of the century, if we double our population, there's no net improvement. So back to the global perspective on population, a lot of international organisations are commenting on the issue and have raised concerns. Late last year, 15,000 scientists from 180 countries put together a report in Bioscience Journal, and the result was, I quote, "the largest group of scientists to have ever put their names to a research paper focused on climate change, also called for population growth to be limited and government to stop only focusing on economic growth." So the science really is in on issues. We know the science is in on climate change. We know the science is in on population as a factor. So people like David Attenborough as well. He's seen much more than most of us, and he's saying that human population growth is the most fundamental issue facing the world. As a sovereign nation, I believe we need to lead by example. If we are to talk to other nations about environmental issues, we need to be acting and then get the credibility to help them do similar things, whether it be on issues such as climate change or population. The fact of the matter is that there are few better policy solutions to protect Australian environment than limiting population growth and abandoning plans for big Australia. That necessarily means lower immigration. The long-term average over the 20th century, 7 million migrants came to Australia in the 20th century. I think everyone agrees that worked fantastically well. 70,000 per year. That's still a bumper crowd at ANZ Stadium. It's a lot of people. So we believe that normalising migration back to that 70,000 per year without any impact on our refugee intake is a more appropriate level to return to. Given our fertility rate, again, is just below 2, around 1.8 children per woman, that would stabilise Australia's population under 30 million by 2050 instead of 40 million and rocketing towards 80 million this century. Again, it's a choice we have. We're often presented as it's inevitable, we're going to grow, especially from property developers. They're usually out there saying, oh, we're a global city, everyone wants to come here, you can't stop anyone. Well, we've always had restrictions on migration. All countries, all sovereign countries can do that if they want to. So that's something that I think we should make the choice. Today on our Facebook page we posted how on the Gold Coast there was a colony of 260 koalas, and all of a sudden it became a shopping centre. And they tried to move the koalas into another region, but over half are already dead within about a year. So these things are happening, this biodiversity loss is happening all over the country through development, through sprawl, through densification. Whether it's our homes or our shopping centres or our land clearing for our farms to feed ever more people, this biodiversity loss is happening everywhere. I think one of the big problems is politics. Politics wants to talk mainly about the economy, but it shouldn't be that way. We know the economy is a fully owned subsidiary of the environment. Every aspect of our economy depends on the environment and its resource base, whether it's the water, the oil, the iron ore, the air, the climate. So you've heard the old saying, it's the economy stupid. It should be, it's the environment stupid. This is what we really need to be talking about. One day I hope our politicians will be saying that. So these finite and non-renewable resource depletions, they are problems for us, but more so for future generations. Across our country, the evidence, the koalas and everything else is happening. We need to talk to our politicians about this. The bottom line is we need to live more sustainably, but it doesn't seem like our politicians really want to listen. The old economic growth, the GDP growth seems to be king. I believe our party, Sustainable Australia, has a broad suite of policies that will address these environmental issues. We would work with all other parties, left or right, to find common ground. Again, it's the environment stupid. If we can start thinking about that and talking to our politicians, I think we'll head in the right direction. Thanks for listening.
The line about the environment.
Sorry folks, just I'll give the one more line there. What was the line?
You want the politicians to say?
Yeah. So you've often heard in politics. You've often heard in politics, it's the economy stupid. But the economy is a fully owned subsidiary of the environment. So it should be, it's the environment stupid.
Excellent, thank you.